Trigger warning. This episode contains a lot of conversation about the concepts of isolation and loneliness and touches on the concept of suicide. If you don't have the mental or emotional bandwidth to listen to a conversation around these topics, I recommend pausing the podcast here, saving it for later, and coming back to it when and if you have the space and the bandwidth for it. Otherwise, let's get into it. Welcome to Big Brave Business. This is the podcast where we answer big questions reshaping entrepreneurship. I'm Sarah K. Heeter, and this is Season 3. Each week, I'm bringing on my friends, mentors, and some of the best thought leaders I know. We dive into bold, values-driven conversations about leadership, equity, ethics, and building businesses that actually make a difference. Ready to do business better? Let's dive in. Welcome back to Big Brave Business. My guest today is a new friend. And man, we've gone deep really quick. Her name is Maggie Arai. And if you don't know her, she runs the community Founders Who Give a Fuck. And she also has an events business called IRL Studio. So welcome to the podcast, Maggie.
Hi, thanks for having me. I'm so excited.
It's funny because we connected on LinkedIn, probably because somebody told me I needed to follow you or you came up in a suggestion or something. And I honestly didn't know anything about you. I don't even remember how we ended up being connected on LinkedIn. And you started posting about this new community, Founders Who Give a Fuck. And even though I probably wouldn't have necessarily used that language in a name, like an offer name. Obviously, this podcast is explicit. I have no problem with explicit language. And just the very clear premise of what the point is behind who you were trying to pull together in community, I was like, yes, we're alike. And if I only knew how much we would actually connect. So whoever it was out there who told me that I needed to connect with Maggie, thanks, because we are two peas in a pod.
Thank you, LinkedIn algorithm or someone.
Yeah. So one of the first things that we connected over, besides just your offer, but this community, but beyond giving a fuck and having that in common, we also both have a bit of a background in policy. And I think that shows up in the foundation of what we do, centering around business ethics and how we show up and how who we are and what we care about carries over into business and how we do business and how we do business with each other and how we're in community with each other. And then on those calls in the community, we've gone even deeper. We share a lot of triggering traumatic patterns and we're just alike. Anyways, the reason why you're here is very clear.
Yeah, and I think I don't know, it's so incredible that I am such a fan of in person, and I think you can't really replace that magic, but I think it's so incredible that we have the internet and we are able to meet people on totally different sides of the globe or people who in different countries who we end up having so much in common. We end up having such deep conversations so quickly. I'm really, really grateful for that.
Yeah, it's such a double-edged sword, isn't it? Because we're 3,000 miles apart. And if we weren't, we would already be hanging out in person. That's
Oh,
just unquestionable. But
yeah.
instead, it's how do we cross country lines and travel 3,000 miles to see each other? That's much more complicated. It's not impossible, but it is much more complicated. So thank you, internet. And also, why did you break my heart like this of connecting with a friend who's 3,000 miles away? So as we were talking about, what could we talk about? Because we could just kind of talk. One of the things that really stood out to you as we were kind of spitballing, there's a few, but one of the concepts is around this idea of how best practices or what we reward publicly is actually harmful or failing each other. And so when that stood out to you, what was it that was coming up for you? What was bubbling up?
Yeah, I think the thing that comes up for me whenever I see that, honestly, is I think that in in general, kind of in society right now, but also very much in the sort of business and entrepreneurship spaces, I think there's a lot of rah rah and this is incredible and rewarding of I'm going to put my head down and I'm going to disappear for 6 months and I'm going to build something all by myself alone in a cave, or I'm going to work these really, really long hours, or I wake up at 5 a.m. and that's the best version of me because I get up at 5 a.m. and I go to the gym and I have multiple hours of work done before any of you losers have woken up. And I think that there's a lot of reward and a lot of almost respect placed on, oh, that person must care about this so much and they must be so successful because they are working so hard at it. And obviously, we know that's toxic from like a hustle culture perspective. But for me, the thing that I find really toxic and really worrying about it is this idea of you should you do your best work and you will be most successful alone or using all of your time on business. Or if you wake up at 5 a.m., if you wake up at 4 a.m., if you're part of that club, you're probably going to bed at 8, 9 o'clock and you finished work, let's just say ostensibly at 5 o'clock. Like, where are the times that you are integrating people into that? When are you seeing people? When are you forming relationships? How are you maintaining relationships? How are you having those connections? So I don't know if that makes sense, but like the number one thing that comes to mind for me, honestly, that I think gets really rewarded is there's a lot of things that we reward that are essentially just isolation. And I don't agree that that makes us more successful. I think it makes us worse.
Yeah.
And even if it didn't make us worse, I just don't think that it's good for us to lose that balance with other people.
This is interesting because from a policy slash political science perspective,
Mhm.
there's a lot of, and I'm even going to go so far as to say social studies. So, like
Yeah.
anything that you've studied within social studies, there is this concept of individualism,
Mhm.
and that individualism is part of like a characteristic of white supremacist patriarchal capitalism because it actually serves to create a bigger gap between like essentially the haves and have nots. That's
Mhm.
really, really surface level summarizing it. So if you've studied this, forgive me for oversimplifying, but if you haven't studied this, hopefully that feels like attainable and accessible. So, this idea of individualism is a huge characteristic in particular of like racism and white supremacy. And so, if you have dug into any of the kind of anti racist stuff, especially since it became very popularized in 2020 and since then, you may hear some of this discussion around the concept of individualism. And what's really interesting is we can look back at like the grander scale of humanity. And
Mhm.
I'm not just talking about like looking all the way back at American history. No, I'm talking about like 10,000 years like of humanity or more.
Mhm.
And being able to see that community over individuals has always been a principle of like the human experience, and it was for survival, it was for the betterment of society, whatever society meant, and yeah, there's just so many fundamental principles of, like, existing that are rooted in community that have been kind of dismantled through this concept of individualism, which only serves to essentially make the rich richer.
Absolutely. Yeah, 100%. And I think that that's such an interesting tie. And what comes up for me when we talk about like individualism is this idea of the American dream and how toxic that is, right? And
Yeah.
this idea of if you work hard, then you will succeed. And very, I'm forgetting like the meritocracy.
Yep.
Right? And, "Oh, America's a meritocracy, and therefore, like, all you have to do is work hard, and if you are not succeeding or if you are not having the things that you want in life, it's because of you and just because of you." And so I completely agree with you, right? Like, that is a system of white supremacy, that is a system of essentially keeping everyone in their places by saying, "Well, but look at this person, like, look at this individual story where this person was able to pull themselves out of poverty or pull themselves out of their circumstances."
Back to back $1,000,000 launches.
Yeah, right. Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, so I completely agree with you, like, it does stem from individualism, and I think that individualism has been so harmful to us in so many different ways, and that idea that you speak of community has always been so important to us, to human beings, and to our survival. It's really interesting to watch how that's been kind of tinkered with. and dismantled in the sense of you don't need quote unquote community anymore in order to survive because I don't need someone to this is maybe dramatic to talk about in a survival sense, but something that I like to talk about is like, hey, I don't need someone to drive me to the airport anymore because I can just get an Uber. And I don't need someone to bring me a hot meal when I am sick and too sick to do it for myself because I can get an Uber Eats. Not to put everything on Uber, but Uber's a problem.
Uber has leached into all of these different aspects. Yeah, I think that's an interesting place to take it, and I think it shows how it's embedded into every part of society and what we do, and business is not unique to that. And one of the things my so when I originally started this podcast, you may not know this if you're a more recent listener, welcome, thank you. But if you're an OG and you've been around for 4 plus years, then you remember that I originally started this podcast with a co-host. And when we started, the reason why we started it is because we felt so lonely in business until we found each other. We'd heard people talk about this concept of like business besties and
Mhm,
having, like, a person or a community of people who, like, really get what it's like and who you can really confide in and, like, be a whole person, including a business owner with, who understands all the facets of you as a human, but also you as a business owner, and we had never had that until we met each other, and that all of a sudden, it was like, "Oh my gosh, not only are we so grateful for each other, but we want to open that door of, like, you can sit with us," right? Like, more people who maybe care about the same kind of things we care about and are aligned in certain ways who can relate to our stories. Like, if we can open that door through a podcast, it's like maybe some other people will feel less alone and can feel like they could build relationships with us through the podcast.
mhm.
When Amanda left the show, I knew that I needed to have guests on for the same purpose. Like, this feeling of connection, like, this is literally my favorite thing that I do in my business. And I think that, yeah, entrepreneurship can be so lonely. I'm gonna pause there. I have so many more thoughts, I'm sure you do too, but I want it to be a two-way conversation, not just me talking. So yeah, I think that's how that shows up, not just in every facet of life, but entrepreneurship specifically.
Yeah, no, I completely agree, and I resonate with everything you're saying, and honestly, you could have used the rest of the podcast just, like, following that thread, and I would have been here like, "Yes, like, carry on." But yeah, 100%. For me, I think it was the exact same thing that led me to start Founders Who Give a Fuck, right? It was this feeling of, yes, you can have amazing people in your lives, like you're in your life, you can have family that's supportive, you can have great friends, but having that like business bestie or just generally having friends who are in business as well, who kind of like understand the shit of it and the highs of it as well,
Yep.
and that you can like really have those deep, honest conversations with and somebody essentially somebody to tell you and I hate using this word, but somebody to tell you, like, "Yeah, you're not crazy," because sometimes it really feels crazy making or just it just you just get in your own head and you just don't know what is right anymore, and I lost the thread of it because now I'm like, "Ugh, I shouldn't say crazy," but But yeah, I think it's so important to have those people, and when I looked at what was out there, I think there are a bunch of amazing founder communities, but for me, I felt really strongly about, like, I wanna start one, A, that's for, again, people who identify with this idea of giving a fuck, very much so. But I also want to start one that is more true to what I think the word community means, which is less about having like a really large network and being in a Slack channel with a bunch of people, and is a lot more about like, how can I help people build those relationships where they will feel seen and they will feel less alone and they will understand, like, I've got other people who are in this with me too. And it just makes it so much easier and it helps you keep going.
Yeah, and I think we coming back to the survival point, it is a matter of survival because I think and this is where that word crazy I actually think is really important and the nuance behind it, etcetera, because I've talked on this podcast, it's actually been 2 years, but I've reran it in 2026 earlier this year, so you can find it pretty easily if you wanna go look for it, but, I had a guest on who said, "I know what the big brave thing is that's on my mind, I know what we need to talk about," and it was that she had just come from, like, a mental health workshop for entrepreneurs and heard all of these wild statistics, which I actually do not remember because we had this conversation 2 years ago,
Mhm.
um, about how much more likely a founder is to struggle with mental health, but in particular, how much more likely an entrepreneur versus a non-entrepreneur is to experience suicidal ideation. And
Mm.
I find this I heard her say it, and it's not that I was questioning it, but I was like, "I need sources," because and so we did. We pulled up sources that we could actually specifically cite, and what immediately started coming to mind is all of the public stories that we've heard of founders of massive brands who died by suicide, and I'm trigger trigger warning aside, I do think it's a matter of survival to talk about this because I think that the reason why those statistics are so much higher for founders has so much to do with this sense of isolation. Our
Mhm.
sense of worth, our sense of value, our identity is so wrapped up in business, and it is so isolating, and it is literally a mental health crisis opportunity. And so, yeah, I think the importance of community is genuinely life-saving work.
That resonates so much, and I completely agree. Like, when I talk about it still being a matter of survival, and then I laugh about saying, like, "Oh, it's funny to talk about, like, an Uber to the airport in terms of survival." It's different from what you're saying now, which I think is so important, that idea of, like, we do still 100% need each other in order to survive and in order to thrive, right? In order to live, in order to be happy, in order to feel like life has meaning. It's so, so important to have one another.
Yeah.
And I hadn't heard that episode and I hadn't heard that statistic, and yet it's also not that surprising to me to hear. And the first thing that came to mind for me was all the stats I've seen about founder loneliness
Mhm.
and how much of a relation, like, I would see there, right? Because when we lose that connection to others, we really lose our connection to ourselves and our tether to, like, yeah, our tether to our mental health, our wellness. That's why I like to talk about connection in the terms of, like, social health or social wellness, because I think it's this third piece of our wellness beyond physical health and mental health that's ties into those things, but it hasn't really been paid that much attention to
Yeah.
recently.
Yeah. It's it's fascinating because one of the examples you gave at the beginning of this had to do with kind of popularized advice about a morning routine. And I talked about this with Katrina, who's also a member of Founders Who
Ah.
Give a Fuck, on a podcast episode earlier this summer where we talked about kind of business advice we hate. And the morning routine was one of the things we talked about. But I think this is a good callback to that episode because I think that it's insidious the ways the isolationism and the individualism can that's a lot of I's. Insidious, isolation, individual. Mm, the ways that it shows up in advice that you might not even necessarily immediately identify as being about individualism and isolation. And so in addition to, like, the morning routine, another thing that's kind of been in the back of my head as we've been talking about this is this rejection of, like, victim mentality. What's interesting is if you were actually to just kind of think about, is victim mentality more about community or is it more about isolation? You might say that victim mentality is like an isolation thing. It's an individual thing, like, "Oh, woe is me, I'm the victim." But
Mhm.
actually the way the, like, rejection of victim mentality tends to get used is to say, like, I refuse to address, like, the systemic harm or the systemic things because I am not a product of my circumstances. I'm a
Mm.
product of my own individual effort, and I refuse to I refuse to let that be what defines me or defines my opportunity for success. That is actually fueling the individualism and the isolation of in in any way you're not quote unquote successful, and we've talked so much this year about redefining success, but in whatever way you're not quote unquote successful, that's your fault when that is an oversimplification of whatever circumstances are currently part of your life or your business. And I think ugh, probably the answer is there's a balance. We don't have to be victims of systems, but we are not immune. There's another I. We're not immune to the systems that we're part of.
Yeah. No, I agree with that. It resonates, and I think the other thing that makes me think of too is not just victim mentality, it doesn't just let me collect my thoughts here because there's, like, something that I wanna say. Gosh. Basically, the idea that, like, you touch on victim mentality is so related to that individualism, and it's so related to, "I will fix it for myself." And I think the flip side of that is if we are getting this advice of don't blame anyone but yourself and kinda don't rely on anyone but yourself, maybe I'm saying the same thing that you were saying, but, like, it strikes me as, yeah, that's a big problem because not only is it saying, "Don't make yourself the victim," it's also saying, if you are feeling something that's bad, it's your responsibility to fix it and change it, and it doesn't suggest, like, going to others. It doesn't
Getting
suggest looking
getting
for
help
help.
or leveraging resources. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, not only are you not the victim, but if you feel like you're the victim, you need to fix it yourself and stop feeling like that.
So how for you as like and I don't wanna call you an expert because that's a lot of pressure, but as between the 2 of us, the resident expert on community and connection, how do the concepts of community and connection actually protect us, like, our humanity while running businesses?
Ooh. Well, running businesses is a great, like, thread to it. I guess I'm gonna start with how does community and connection protect our humanity, and then I think that'll take me to where it ties into good businesses as well. But the thing that I feel like is so important when we think about connection and community, and this is another piece, again, going back to that idea of survival. So we talked about survival from sort of like a personal perspective and a mental health perspective, and we need each other for that. But also going back to survival at a more macro level, I think connection and community is so important because when people don't have it, we see the kinds of things that they turn to instead, right? And it's an oversimplification, but you look at who is most easily recruited towards extremism or to certain like terrorist groups or to be extreme right wing, like any of these really extreme ideologies and these like groups that are like the manosphere recently, right? You look at who is most easily targeted and brought into those things. And it's not always the case, but a lot of the time they are specifically targeting people who are lonely and who feel like they don't have community. Because if you are missing that and you feel like I don't have anyone, and then you get an opportunity to join a community and have people around you and feel that sense of belonging that we crave so badly, it's so much more easy. Like it's so much more easy to fall down those paths. And it's so much more easy to hate other people or lash out at the world or feel like it's other people's fault, like it's women's fault that they don't wanna date me, and it's right? It's the left wing's fault that I am not making the money that I wanna make, and I don't mean to reduce that into kind of almost being the same thing that we were talking about with victim mentality,
Yeah.
but I think it's really interesting when we see the sort of harm that comes about in people's mental health that doesn't just stay inside the person, right? That has waves, big ripple effects across our whole society, and it shapes what's going on in our world right now in a very real and a very important way. So I think that's the number one thing that I think of when you pose that. And when it comes to business, I think it's kind of the same, and it does go very deep because if you think about the businesses that I would like, if you think about the business owners that I would accuse of not giving a fuck, I mean, Jeff Bezos comes to
Right.
mind. I had made a LinkedIn post about Jeff Bezos, and it was my most divided one, right? Because there were people in there being like, "Yes, absolutely, I agree with you, like, this is shitty business practice," and there were a lot of people in there defending him, and some of the defense was like, "Oh, well, say what you want, but he's a billionaire." And it kinda comes back to all the conversations you've been having and a few of the conversations we've been having about, like, well, what does success look like? And if you are just pardoned because you've become a billionaire and you've achieved success, so who am I to sort of insult him or insult his practices? Then what does that say about what we think is important? I've definitely lost the thread here a little bit, but I guess my point is that if you are not thinking about community and if you are not thinking about like how do my actions affect others and you're only thinking about me and how does my business grow and how does my business succeed, that's where we get these businesses where you have workers collapsing on the job, you have a ton of different complaints being filed, you have total exploitation, and they are such a big part of our world right now. They employ so many people, they impact so many people that that does matter. That goes beyond business back into the whole world, and how are we all being impacted and what is happening as a result of people being told you should succeed in this way and success is individualism and don't worry about other people. Don't worry about community. Maybe that doesn't tie so much to whether the person themselves is connected, but it definitely ties to whether they think about and care about community and whether they think about just other humans in general. To a certain extent, we have to accept that we are all a community with each other.
Yeah, this is definitely related to the concept of, like, what is success. And and yeah, I think you're spot on as far as, like, protecting humanity as a community problem, community solution kind of perspective. What's funny is when I posed the question to you, I, of course, was thinking about, like, what my opinion is. Funny enough, my opinion was so much more, I guess I'll say individual, but it
Mhm.
is still community. But it's about also, in addition to all the things you said, I would say my experience has also been what you and I talked about before we hit record, which had to do with some stuff that came up on a Founders Who Give a Fuck call this past week, which at the time that this airs was a month ago. But I shared something, and at first I was just sharing, like, essentially, like, I'm gonna call it visibility, but with boundaries. Like, just I described it to you before we hit record as, like, drop a breadcrumb. This is the deeper thing, but I just met you all, so this is not, I'm not asking anybody to, like, play therapist with a stranger at this moment in time. Here's,
Yeah,
like, this breadcrumb, but here's what I plan to talk about. And the
yeah,
breadcrumb resonated so much with some of the people on the call that I kept going with that thread, and in the immediate, what having that kind of reception meant when I dropped this, like, "Hey, here's the deeper thing, just so you know," and that resonated, my first response was, "Wow, I feel less alone." Like, I feel really seen, feel really validated. I feel like I'm not the only person who's experienced this emotion, which you and I were talking about how so many people show up to these kind of calls with that, like, this is this weird, unique, special circumstance for me, and, like, let me talk to you about it, and actually what they come to find out is, like, no, we, like, all get it. So in
yeah,
our own way, our own flavor, but, like, we all get it. So
yeah,
when I shared it, that was my first reaction, and actually on that call, it went so deeply for some of us that what I ended up getting off the call feeling was, I didn't just share that for me. I shared that also for the other people who were present because it meant something to not just me. It meant something to more than just me, right? And that
yeah,
really matters, and I think, like, especially for marginalized folks who probably community is even more essential for, because you don't just inherently have community out in just existing if you, I mean, by the nature of, like, the definition of what it means to be marginalized, right? And so, like, having community in the margins also means there's some shared experiences and some shared identity pieces that, yeah, I don't know how to finish that sentence.
No, I 100%, and I think it's the thing that it makes me think, and I don't know whether this is gonna be useful or not, or move us forward or not, or end up on the podcast or not, but, like, the thing that it immediately makes me think about too is this idea that we've reached this point where there are so many people, and we've divided all the people in so many ways with racism and tribalism and xenophobia and all of these different things. We've decided to divide ourselves up, and we are right now at this point where we're like, I I need to be able to have so much control over who is in my community. And I choose my community, and I only want to be in community with either people who look like me or people who feel like me or think like me or all of those things. And that's not to say, that's not me dismissing the importance of having people who understand you and who you feel you can be your full self with. I think that's very, very important to be clear. But there's almost a loss of the understanding of what community at its core was supposed to be, which is just like we are sharing a space together and we're all going to be quite different. And maybe that's a little bit of rose-colored glasses on it, because I think there can be a lot of problems too with communities where it's you have to change yourself to fit into it. But there was this sense, I think that part of the problem that we have with isolation right now is individualism is kind of teaching us, like, you should only be connected to people who you're really, really excited to be connected to. And that drops this idea of, like, there might be a friend of a friend who you find a little bit annoying, but you should still be showing up for your friend. Or there might be people who are relatives. And I'm not talking about when relationships get toxic and they are no longer good for you, but I'm just talking about, like, mild annoyances, or we don't see things quite the same way. And that ability to communicate with each other is starting to kind of fall by the wayside in favor of, I'm going to build my own community and it's only going to have this person in it. Maybe kind of an ironic thing to say as a founder of a founder community where we do have sort of specific criteria to be in there. But I consider that a little bit different from
Yeah.
sort of trying to cultivate, like, I only have these types of people in my life, and if
And
you fall outside of that, you're
it's
gone.
interesting. What's coming up for me with that is this kind of concept, and again, I'm gonna take it more to, like, a policy perspective because that's something we have in common. But just to kind of show the example of how this looks for humanity on a grander scale and not
Mhm.
just, like, how does this affect me in my business right now, which is that how this shows up in tax policy, and we so often have this mindset of, like, if we don't have certain criteria in common, it's your problems are not my problem. Like,
Mm,
and I mean, probably you could even just say your problems are not my problem. Like, and there's been this frustration between me and a family member in my life who we have very, very different perspectives and priorities when it comes to politics. Okay, that's a lot of peas. I'm really into the like
I
same
know the
thing.
alliteration, it's
Um,
amazing.
so, anyways, we go back to this meme that was really popular several years ago of, "I don't know how to tell you you should care about other people." Like, I don't know how to make you care about other people. I just inherently do, and the fact that you
Mm,
don't makes you an asshole. Like, that's how I feel. And I
yeah.
feel frustrated by this, right? And in our relationship continuously, me and this family member. And what's interesting is I hear this kind of argument about, like, student loan forgiveness or funding school lunches or even funding public education in general, definitely funding healthcare. Like, my taxes shouldn't go pay for other people's problems. Like, I shouldn't be funding other people's problems, and it's, like, such an individualistic point of view, which is what has been just permeated into every aspect of our culture to the point where we really believe, like, our own individual experience is more important than the collective experience of all of us together as humans, and yeah, that actually, like, hurts all of us because there's actually enough resources and supports of all kinds available that if we could come together and be a community on a larger scale, then actually, like, I mean, those problems don't have to exist, like, literally for anybody. And the only reason they exist is because we have forced this individualism down our throats to perpetuate these problems again, so that earning gap continues to get bigger and the, like, gap between classes continues to grow,
Mhm,
and it actually serves to keep oppressed people oppressed. Whereas it actually doesn't have to exist like that. Like, we actually could just, like, support each other, and then nobody has those issues, and, like, they do become community issues, but I shouldn't have to prove to you that it will ultimately affect you in order for you to care. We could just care about each other, and that's something that I think, like, pursuing community helps us get back in touch with on a smaller scale, like, just having people to brainstorm with to help you, like, come up with ideas for what your offer should be called or to run a price point by somebody or to talk about how do I respond to this email or whatever, like, we are so eager for community that people are literally turning to AI for scratching
mhm,
that itch to be able to have, like, even kids, right? We're hearing these stories that turn into horror stories of, like, the dependency we get from a parasocial relationship with a robot
mhm.
because we are so starved for that level of connection with each other. And so it doesn't have to be big things to start. It can be little things, but the little things become big when we're living in a really isolationist, especially post quarantine, a really
Yeah.
isolationist. culture.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what that makes me think about is this idea of I'll often hear kind of like, oh, people these days are so individualistic, or like people these days don't want this, or they don't want to say hi, or they don't want to talk to me, X, Y, and Z. And I find that really interesting. And I sometimes find that a very frustrating stance. I can understand why people feel that way and they want to put things out there that way. But what I'm seeing is really the opposite. What I'm seeing is that for me, the second I started my previous business, which was called Happier, and it was events for adults to make friends, it blew up on social media. And my events were selling out in 48 hours from the second that I started. And it was something that people were craving. They wanted to connect with each other. They just didn't know how, and they didn't know where the spaces were that they were allowed to do that. And so it's less that people all have these individualistic mindsets. It's that exactly like as you've been saying, that's sort of permeated into the culture, that's taught, that's sort of it's encouraged, but people don't necessarily want that. I think people do want a whole bunch more community. Like tying that to what I'm doing right now with Founders Who Give a Fuck and also with IRL Studio, people want to get together in person. There is kind of a pushback. It's so interesting because we see those horror stories about parasocial relationships with AI, just like you're talking about. And yet at the same time, the advent of I guess I shouldn't say advent, it's not like it's brand new, but it becoming really a big part of the social consciousness has had this huge sort of pendulum swing effect where people are really pushing back against that and wanting even more to be in person, wanting even more to be analog, wanting even more to like find ways to connect with other actual human beings and kind of rejecting this idea of connection as AI, kind of rejecting even the idea of somebody writing a post with AI, because I think that the anger and the frustration that comes out there is you didn't let me get to know anything about you. And I'm sure there's other pieces of it, but that's what comes up for me. So, yeah, I mean, I guess just going back to this idea, I don't think that people individually want to be individualistic anymore. Obviously, there's always exceptions to all rules, and this is a broad brush to paint with. But I think there's a lot of people who are craving connection, who are craving community. And to a certain extent, like we just don't know how. And we just don't know how to prioritize it. And we're trying to flex muscles that have kind of, I don't want to say they've atrophied, but they've been underused as compared to our other muscles. And so now we're out here trying to lift dumbbells with our pinky fingers, kind of being like, how do I do this again? But I think the desire is there, and that's what makes me really hopeful.
It's interesting because I was thinking the same exact words when you said they don't know how. I was thinking they don't know how even to recognize it. I think, like,
Yeah.
maybe we know we're craving something. Maybe we know we're craving connection. Maybe we know we're craving in person. Maybe we know we're craving more human, whatever that is. But it is still hard to recognize sometimes the patterns, like I said, like the insidiousness
Mhm.
of how ingrained it is. Like how many people will go to bat for Jeff Bezos on your LinkedIn
Right.
post, right? Like, for what? Jeff's never gonna see that. He doesn't give a shit about you. So, like, what who are you virtue signaling with that,
Yeah.
right?
Like, poor
Meanwhile, to
Jeff.
your point, there are real people dying in warehouses and their loved ones, they are gonna see your comment, right? And so, like, I think yeah, that is so fascinating about how ingrained it is, and I think too, even with the advice that's given in business of, like, morning routine stuff and the convenience of,
Mhm.
like, Uber and whatnot, like those examples you gave at the beginning, we don't see it as a problem. We see it as innovation, or we see it as advice from somebody who's come before, or somebody who has something that we want, right? Something we covet. And so we want to follow their example. We want to follow their lead. We're starving for advice of, like, I've said this on this podcast before. This gets a little deep if you're, like, not into, if you haven't yet forayed too far into criticizing capitalism, but, like, literally capitalism functions on creating pain, reinforcing that pain as much as possible. We're all walking around feeling that pain, and we're desperate for a solution, and we're
Mhm.
willing to pay whatever it takes to get the solution, which capitalism then offers. We can sell you this solution.
Mhm.
And when that solution doesn't work, capitalism blames you, that you're the reason why it didn't work, but don't worry, here's another thing I can sell you. It's literally how it's built. And so when we don't necessarily know or identify that we're part of this pattern, and so things that seem really like a surface or really, what's the word I'm looking for? Like not scary, not threatening. Like, hey, here's a millionaire morning routine. This is what you need to do. We think like, oh, okay, so then that's what I need to change. And thank God, because I've just been looking for the solution. Or we can go a little bit further than that and say things like digital courses. This was the big thing coming out of quarantine, right? Or during quarantine of like, start a digital course. It's going to solve everything. Like, this is the
Mhm.
thing. This is your ticket. This is what you need to do. Whatever it is you know a lot about or you have experience doing, it doesn't matter. Every single person could do this. If you start a digital course, this is the if you build it, they will come secret
Right.
to like solving your pain. And it actually didn't for most people. And even for
Mhm.
people who were quote unquote successful at selling a course, did it solve the pain? That's
Right.
the question, right? And so I think like, yeah, I don't know. That's a pretty deep thing to leave on. I don't wanna, like, end there. I feel like we need a hopeful, optimistic. So in working in events, working in community building, you've done community building before, you're doing community building now. What does the future look like that you hope for? What do you think what's the optimistic thing we can end on here?
Yeah, first of all, I wish we had another hour
We
to pull
can.
at the
Let's schedule another one.
thread. But honestly, to me, I think the hopeful thing to me is that pendulum swing. It is the fact that people want this and they're asking for this. And I don't want to say that in a way that ignores the great point that you just made about capitalism and creating problems and then selling us a solution to those problems, because I think that that's deeply embedded here and we see that happening. And I also see it happening where the user is blamed when it doesn't work in things like, and I'm gonna name these things. I'm not against them because I think that they can help people, but you see things like Bumble BFF or you see certain types of events. And there is this feeling of that's how you make friends. And I gave you a solution and you paid for it. And if you weren't able to do it, then you must have done it wrong. And with friendship specifically, that is so hard and such a difficult thing to feel is like, I tried and I paid for the solution and I still wasn't able to do it. So it must be something about me that people don't want to connect with me, that people don't want to be friends with me. When a lot of the time, this is brand new as a problem that like capitalism is trying to solve. And I say that with huge air quotes that people are trying to solve within a capitalist system is probably more accurate to say. And so a lot of the time we're doing it wrong and we don't know what structures to put in place. And that's why I think that having really, really intentional communities, having really intentional events is so important because we're past the point where I wanna see people throw a bunch of people into a room, give them a happy hour ticket, and say, like, "Go nuts." And if you don't connect with someone, it's because you didn't have the right stuff to walk up and make good conversations and make good connections. I wanna see events that give people a little bit more structure and a little bit more permission to connect with each other and to actually have those touch points because I think part of the problem of loneliness is that that permission has slowly been taken away. And what we see and what the experts talk about is that as soon as you have a way of permission of engaging with one another, as soon as you have a signal that there's some permission, whether it's you're walking your dog or they've done all kinds of interesting experiments where somebody walks down the street with a giant spoon and all of a sudden people who didn't talk to them. So I guess the hopeful note that I would end on is still that idea of like people want it. They're just looking for permission to talk to you. Not absolutely everyone is going to end up being your best friend, but like we're all out here looking to connect with one another. And I think that that's a beautiful thing. And I think we're going to learn to do it better and better. And I think the more that we put structures in place, the more that we bring that permission back to say hi to each other on the street, to say hi to a stranger at the coffee shop, and to just engage like in a much more honest way with each other. I think that we are going to see this go back. I don't see loneliness ending. I don't see it just getting worse and worse until we all end up sitting in hotel rooms alone together. Like, we clearly want to fix it. There's such an appetite for it. And so to me, that is hopeful.
Yeah, yeah, I love that, and I want more events like that. I think that takes me to, like, the awkwardness of a networking event where you're just like, I don't know, yeah, we could definitely spend another hour together. I'm not gonna, like, open up more cans, but I wanna say thank you so much for being here, Maggie. I really, really appreciate it, and it's, of course, been fun. I feel like since we met, we just speak the same language, and yeah, it's nice to feel that, and I hope you listening, that you also felt that too, that you get to, as Amanda and I used to say, you get to sit with us. You get to be part of the conversation, and even if you don't have a background in policy, and so if some of this stuff is, like, a little in the weeds for you, just the general concepts and stuff, like, we wanna talk about it with you. We wanna have these conversations with you, and as I always say, I'm gonna say it again, our information is in the description of the episode, so about us, my links, Maggie's links, and you are so enthusiastically invited into our DMs. We want to genuinely want to hear what came up for you, what you agree with, what you think maybe was missing from the conversation or didn't resonate. Like we genuinely want to have that conversation, and yeah, hopefully at the very least somebody out there feels less alone. So thank you again, Maggie, for being here. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much. This has been incredible.
And for you listening, thank you so much for being here, and we'll see you right here next week.